Well, I'll have a few slides to go through as we have a look at things. We've called this Cool News, You're on Your Own Now. Why are we so anxious in an age of self-reliance? And it is true that we live in an anxious age. 3 years ago was the Olympics, not 4. If anyone can recall that we had the Olympics in 2021. And we were watching a particularly exciting race at our house, probably the 1500 metres, the men's, and my wife decided to interrupt me and have a long conversation, probably longer than the race was going to be. And she said, and she's a clinical psychologist, and she said to me, which is brutal really, because she knew that I wanted to watch this race, anxiety is the gold medal podium winner of mental health at the moment. Bar none. Anxiety is the gold medal of mental health. It seems to be ravaging us. And 3 years later, the Olympics comes round again, and it seems no different. It feels we've trained for anxiety to be the gold medal winner once again. And part of that seems incongruent to the fact that we live in an age of self-reliance, as we're going to look at, the you do you life that we can live in this world, where we have so many opportunities for experiences that we want to have. The experience bucket in our cultural moment is full. You can do anything you want to do, really, if you have enough money and time and consent, because consent seems to be the only bar, the only restriction in our cultural moment. But it seems that the meaning and purpose bucket is quite empty. It's got a hole in the bottom of it. The people are not sure why we're doing what we're doing, or why we're allowed to, or why we should or shouldn't. And often, all of these experiences that we have don't add up to much other than anxiety for many people. I wonder if anxiety will be the gold medal winner in 4 years' time, the next Olympics. It would seem to be that we live in an anxious age. And tonight I want to rove across a few philosophers and speakers and thinkers and writers about the issue of anxiety, looking at it from a Christian framework. Perhaps you're not a Christian here today, that's fine, that's welcome along. But I want to look at it from how does a Christian framework speak into some of these anxiety issues as well, and how does that help us as we go through life? And so I had a lot of philosophers to choose from, so I picked a great American philosopher poet to begin with, Taylor Swift. You laugh. But she speaks, doesn't she, for so many people. I'm sure there are people here who went or wanted to go. You don't have to show me your hands. But Taylor Swift gave the commencement address in 2022 at New York University. Fancy that. So this is someone who's no slouch. This is someone who the New York University knew speaks for a young crowd. She thinks like they think. She writes songs in ways that they listen to. And she said this in her speech to the brightest, wealthiest, safest students on the planet, New York University. How do I give advice to this many people about their life choices? I won't. Scary news is you're on your own now. Cool news is you're on your own now. Now, you can go online and get the full transcript of that speech. And what is really interesting about the speech is that much of it, to the brightest, wealthiest, safest students on the planet, is keep your nose above the waterline. It's tough out there on your own. Be careful. Survive. Now, the year I was born, 1967, if you had given the same commencement address at New York University to the brightest, wealthiest, safest people on the planet about just keep your nose above the waterline, it's tough out there, you would have probably been scorned off campus. Because in 1967, the tune might have been more along the lines, reach for the stars, which 2 years later, of course, they did, 1969. It would have been a together we can do this kind of speech. And here we are in 2022 onwards, 1 year after one Olympics, 2 years before the next. Scary out there. It's cool out there. Both mean that you're on your own. So let's look at the cool news aspect of that for a little while, because we do live in an age that's self-reliant in many respects, the age of what is called expressive individualism, a term coined by late sociologist Robert Bellah. Cool news is you're on your own now. Central to our understanding of ourselves in a psychological age is this idea of we are on our own. We kind of are looking out from this, like behind this visor of self at the world out there. We are on our own. And it's cool news because often that whole idea of you do you, which we'll look at, is painted against a picture of a past of repressive, cloying, overbearing expectations of a community or an institution, an authority figure. The water we swim in now in our cultural moment is the expressive individualism world, the you do you world. That's just the way it is. We've had a couple of generations of that. Now, that is in the West, we have to admit, because we have other cultures that come to a Western setting and are quite shocked by what they see. I can't get into an Uber without a young, either a Muslim or a Hindu or a Sikh or someone from sub-Saharan Africa asking me questions about what I believe and often saying, I don't get some of the things that go on in your cultural moment. I can put it that way. But you're always anxious. You worry about everything. You have everything. You work too hard. You don't do family life the way we would. All these sorts of things. Sometimes it takes another person looking into the window of our culture for us to understand it. Cool news is you're on your own now. And we're in that moment, I think, where we're in a shift from what a writer and philosopher in an American called Dale Kuhn, in a book called Sex and the I World, about relationships beyond the age of individualism. He compares what he calls the T world, or the traditional world of the past, with what he calls the I world. So a traditional world where people are doing things more thickly within community, where what the community thinks is the preference for how you should behave, versus the I world, which sort of speaks for itself, doesn't it, in many respects? And he says we're in this tussle at the moment between the T world and the I world. Puts it this way: personal relational choice is replacing the T world's relational matrix as the preferred path to human freedom and fulfillment. The T world has been replaced by the I world. And he said the T world is based upon relationships of mutual obligation, and the I world is predicated upon relationships of personal choice. And he says they are oil and water, that we are moving away from relationships of mutual obligation in how we do community life to relationships of atomised personal choice. These are two competing views of the world. And both of them see themselves as the preferred path to human freedom and fulfilment. That freedom in the T world is about how you do life together in community. And freedom in the I world is how you express yourself from your psychological self to the world out there. But I think Dale Kuhn is right. The T world is being replaced by the I world. And it would be easy to say, well, then we've got to stop reading those books which tell us about, we should be living for the I. But that's not how culture works. The way culture works is that it's caught as much as it's taught. Your reflexive thinking isn't shaped by you sitting down poring over a study guide to how do I live in the I world, or why should I reject the T world? It's just caught. Each of us is discipled, so to speak, into the view of the world that we have. Now, Rory Shiner, that's not Rory Shiner, that is Rory Shiner looks better than that, but is just as smiley. He wrote this article in the Gospel Coalition website around the issue of expressive individualism. And he says these words: "We are not argued into expressive individualism. We are formed into it. To live in modern Australia is to be part of a relentless discipleship program. Every Pixar and Disney film, every graduation speech, every new novel and Netflix series is 100% on point. Your purpose in life is to find the true inner you and then to express that to the world. That's the point of your life. Find out who you really are internally. We live in a psychological age, which is why we live in an anxious age. And my wife is a clinician. So, there's good money to be had in an anxious age, so, let's not get out of it too quickly. I'm being facetious. But what is interesting is that if in all of this opportunity we have to make expressive hay in the individual age while the sun shines, my wife is booked out with anxiety, people, with issues. Not just personal anxiety. I think if you do have personal anxiety issues, you should go and see a clinician. But there's a societal anxiety that people cannot articulate. But Rory is right. We catch these things. We are not argued into the "you're on your own now." We're formed into it. Every Pixar, every Disney film. It's you do you. It's follow your heart. It's don't let that T world determine the course of your life, because it will crush you. And it always ends in the movie, where they have released themselves into the I world. But it doesn't say too much about the end results of that. And then we are shaped by our practices. And then our practices become the things we love, and the things we love become the things that we assume are the only way to do life. You see, we are not driven in the public sphere of or even our private lives by French philosophy, which says, man is born free but everywhere finds himself in chains, as Rousseau said. And those were the chains in Rousseau's mind of government and religion and marriage in particular for Rousseau. But the people producing the movies, the thinking, are steeped in that. You don't read Rousseau, you watch Frozen. That's the way it is. That's how we catch things. And everything in our cultural moment is shaped towards that. Now, I want to show you two photographs of T world and I world at the apex of the pyramid of our cultural times. This is the last picture taken of the Queen before she died, 2 days before. One Elizabeth who'd been reigning for a long time met another Elizabeth who reigned for 47 days as the Prime Minister of the UK. This is a classic example, the Queen, of the T world, the world of duty and service and subsuming self. And it was interesting that when the Queen died, we celebrated that as a kind of lost world. We celebrated it even though we realised that the death of the Queen was a line drawn under that kind of way of looking at the world as the default. Even as we avoid it ourselves, well, the interesting thing about the Queen's funeral too was that she chose every song, every reading to sort of thumb her nose at a modernist way of looking at the world. But it was her funeral was the last real big moment, I think, in our culture of a celebration of that T world. And there's no going back at some level. We're not going back to the 1950s. It's just not going to happen. And would we want to? For all of those of us who go, well, we should have more of a traditional world. My mum grew up in the 50s in Northern Ireland in a very strict household. And it wasn't a lot of fun for her. Even as we try to avoid it, we celebrate it. But how did the Queen become the Queen? Well, she became the Queen because her dad was the king. But why was her dad the king? Because her dad's brother, David, or Edward, as his regent name was, abdicated the throne. It was a prime example of the T world and the I world coming into conflict. Edward, fell in love with a divorced American socialite, Wallace Simpson, whose husband was still alive, ex-husband was still alive. And the Crown, the government, and the people would not countenance that. Duty, please, Edward. And Edward went no and abdicated. And his brother became king. And hence we have the Queen. The T world took ascendancy at that point. The Queen died. This is our new king and his queen. Divorced, husband still alive. Celebrated by the Crown, the government, and the people. Now, this is not a value judgment. This is just saying, how different are the worlds? How different things have moved in 50 or 60 years of our cultural moment. And in fact, listening to the King's speech compared to the Queen's speech, you already see the shift in the dynamic at Christmas time as the King spoke. So there's this huge shift in how our cultural moment is put together. Now, not everyone's thinking about the King or the Queen when they do their own lives. Most of us in our Western setting are just going, how can I get along in my life and just survive and enjoy as much as I can and not get hit by too much bad stuff? I think that's probably most people in their lives. How do I do the relationships I want? How do I avoid the bad stuff? How do I manage? Here's a picture of a holiday that my family had. It looks like it's an amazing place in Europe. It isn't. It's in Western Australia. It's called Mindarie Keys, or the Mindarie Marina. And about 30 years ago, it was a wasteland of a blowy coastal bit of Western Australia. We couldn't actually swim on the beach, and you still can't because it's too dangerous. So we went for a holiday there, obviously, summer holiday. Now, this is looking out the back door of the place we rented, and there's this beautiful marina, and it's quiet and tranquil. And you can see the rocks up in the corner of it where the marina comes round, protecting that area from the wind and waves which batter that part of the coast. And one day, my wife and I went down to one of the beautiful cafes and the pub down there. It was just full of heaving with people. And it was just fun. And I said, this is probably what Australian life looks like on heaven on a stick. No one's thinking too much about whatever the rest of their week. This is what life's like. And probably people aren't thinking about church on Sunday. Apart from us here of all these 1,000 people, does anyone think about Jesus, for example? Who he is? What he's about? It's about, can I eke enough pleasure out of this thing called life for 80 years? As much pleasure for as long as I can. And Mindarie Marina will do that for you. Every Australian, I think, generally, is trying to carve out a Mindarie Marina life for themselves. That's not to say a value judgment, that's just the way things are. And in one sense, it works. We don't have the traditional world that says you must do things this way. We go, no, we can do things our own way for a while. Why would we want to go back to that? The cultural moment we're living in is very much about the autonomous self. You're on your own and it's cool news. The problem with that, of course, is that it starts to present things that we hadn't thought about Who would have thought about that? That somehow this great idea that we're going to live for ourselves in an age of expressive individualism where the decisions we make for ourselves cannot be challenged by some sort of tradition or framework. But it has real-time consequences. Now, here's one of them. This is a comment by Tom Holland. Now, if you're under 30 here, you're expecting to see a guy in blue and red spandex called Spider-Man. Sorry, it's a historian, Tom Holland. And I'm going to read this to you because you can't see it on the screen. But Tom Holland is very interested in Christianity as someone who dabbles on the edges of it as a historian. And he found a tweet which is really interesting. And he writes, "No, this really is post-Christian." And it's a tweet which talks about the new Canadian survey on attitudes to euthanasia. In Canada, last year, 27% of the population think people should have access to euthanasia because of poverty, which rises to 41% among 18 to 34-year-olds who think that. 28% think that there should be access to euthanasia for homelessness. 43% for mental illness, and 50%, rising to 60% among 18 to 34-year-olds, for people with a disability. And you might think, brave new world, that's bad. But people aren't thinking you should have access to those things because we just want to be a dystopian zombie apocalypse future where we're killing everyone. This is the end of extreme autonomy, that you should be able to make that decision for yourself regardless of a community framework. This is extreme individualism brought to its ultimate conclusion. And why does Tom Holland call it post-Christian? Well, he says it was Christianity that gave a framework of how we are to look after the weaker, the lesser in our culture. That's part of what it means to not be on our own. In the Netherlands in May, a young woman at 29 years of age was allowed state-sanctioned suicide at the age of 29 for mental illness. Not because the culture was trying to be brutal, because it was celebrating her autonomy. It's an interesting implication in Holland, Tom Holland, that he realises that that's post-Christian. That corporate ethics, looking after the whole and the weak in the whole, is central to Christianity. And Robert Bellah, the late sociologist who coined the term expressive individualism, said that just at the moment we're realising the sanctity of the individual above anything, we're starting to lose the frameworks and structures that could keep individuals together. What is interesting about these statistics, and it's something I write about in my book, Future Proof, is that each of these areas, disability, mental illness, homelessness, poverty, the percentage of those who approve of euthanasia ramps up among the 18 to 34-year-olds. And in 30 years' time, the 18 to 34-year-olds now will be the people who set the cultural tone in the West. I just assume that those figures will keep rising. Our autonomous culture has got a beautiful apocalypse. It's not a zombie apocalypse, it's a beautiful facade. Expressive individualism, do what you want, but we will not put together a structure in our community that will stop things like this happening. We don't have the language or framework to do so. Tom Holland did not necessarily believe that Jesus rose from the dead, because he's not there yet as a historian. But he said the Christians did, and it changed how they did life. Roman life in the first century was brutish. It was about power. And the community of Jesus followers changed how they did life. It became a much more community not based on tribe, not based on power, but based on love that drew people together, that was based on serving and forgiving, things like that. So you can see that what our culture offers us, in many ways it's good, you can do what you want, has a cost, a deep cost to it. Which is why, in one sense, scary news is you're on your own now. Many writers are pointing this out. My doppelganger, Alan O. Noble his name is, or I call him O. Noble Alan, because it sounds so noble to be called O. Noble Alan. He's got a book which deals with all of these issues called You Are Not Your Own, Living for God in an Inhuman World. And he says this: everyone is on their own private journey of self-discovery and self-expression, so that at times modern life feels like billions of people in the same room shouting their own name so that everyone else knows they exist and who they are, which is a fairly accurate description of social media. Now, in one sense, we laugh about that, especially those of us who are not digital natives. But the 18 to 34-year-olds of this culture are going to be those who, in the end, see the deepest expressions of how social media and immersive technologies will take you into your own. And Alan Noble says this is an exhausting process, to always live as an individual before the rest of the world, but having to sort of shout your own name to show that you matter, that you exist. Another great writer on this is Tara Isabella Burton. She says this: our economic, cultural and personal lives are suffused with the notion that we can and should transform ourselves into modern-day deities, simultaneously living works of art to be admired by others and ingeniously productive economic machines. What she's saying is that our ecosystem of our culture reinforces this idea that we are our own, that we are simply there to express ourselves to the world and want the world to like the expression that we give. And we do that all over the place. And technology is aiding that. And the question is Amish the only option to get out of that? Just shave my lip and I'm there to go. Is there a certain level of technology that we need to stop at? Well, I don't think we live in that world. We live in a world that we live in. We cannot go back in a time machine to the 1950s. But much of this is what has led to the huge rise of personal and cultural anxiety. Am I good enough? Am I doing enough? Am I missing out on something in how I'm going? It's exhausting. And it's interesting in my wife's practice, the one cohort that she sees often are young women about the age of 23 who went to very good schools. And they come to see her upset and anxious because every graduation speech they went to said, you're going to do amazing. You can be anything you want. And the boyfriend that they had at the time was charming. And at 23, 5 or 6 years later, the boyfriend hasn't been so charming. They've been through a few difficult relationships. And that job that was going to provide hasn't quite materialised. Or it has, and it's crushing them with the expectation as they compare themselves unfavourably to others. It's like pulled the expressive individual handle and it broke off at some stage. And they're going, what do I do now? How do I move forward in life? That's why Tim Keller, the late Tim Keller, writing in an article in The Atlantic. His last article before he died, the New York pastor and writer and thinker. He wrote this: "The modern self is exceptionally fragile. Here's the issue," he says. "While having the freedom to define and validate oneself is superficially liberating, it is also exhausting. You and you alone must create and sustain your identity." And then he says this: "This has contributed to unprecedented levels of depression and anxiety and never satisfied longings for affirmation." That's the problem. It's fragile and it's tiring. And we've lived in an era where everyone got a trophy for about 3 generations of school, right? Everyone was affirmed because we said, if we affirm you all the time, you will feel affirmed. And guess what? Guess how much affirmation is enough? Just a little bit more. That's our problem. I'm not sure of myself, but I need you to be sure. And it's tiring. And Tim Keller said, we will reach a point where that's going to break.
Yeah.
The article is actually entitled "Why He Thinks That Revival is Due in America in the Church." Even while the tide of church attendance goes out, he said, well, tides come back in. There's something about the way Jesus' community can do life that can show us a way forward through this affirmation. And the stats bear out what Tim Keller says here in Australia. The Australian Bureau of Statistics from 2021, just under 40% of 16 to 24-year-old Australians, that's 1.1 million people, reported having a mental disorder in 2021, far higher than the overall proportion of 21.4% for all Australian adults. Well, double, actually, percentage-wise. Huge issue of anxiety and mental health issues. And granted, we have the language to describe that, a younger cohort does, but there's something going on. As I said, not much has changed between the Olympics. Not much at all. But let's go back to Mindarie for a little while. No, it was great, by the way. It was a great holiday. Loved it. What was interesting, though, was that the back door was the main door, because the front door of that apartment we stayed in, every time I went to open it, it almost blew in my face. It was salt encrusted on one side. So it felt like a TARDIS. You go in this tiny little door at the front, but at the back it was like this. It was constant windy. It was waves everywhere. The sign on the beach said, "Do not swim here." And we crafted this marina. And if you can just shape yourselves that way, away from all that turmoil, you can somehow craft a life for yourself, a Mindarie marina life. Here's the thing about the wind and the waves. Every now and then in your life, a rogue wave will sweep over the top of your Mindarie marina. That's Australia. Cannot avoid disappointment, loss, breakdown in relationship, job loss, ill health. A wave is coming. It is not all expressive individualism, hey, while the sun shines. We need more than that, because a wind will sweep over us, or a wave will smash over the rocks of turmoil, trouble and loss. Part of our anxiety in our culture is that people don't know what to do with that when it happens. They don't know where to park it. And what's been interesting the last 5 years is seeing a growth in those same philosophers at elite level who were telling us, live for you, this is all there is, changing their tune. Not all of them, and not fully, but the conversation has certainly arisen because of the anxieties of our age. This is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, famous thinker, writer, speaker, philosopher, Good friend of Richard Dawkins, the atheist scientist who wrote The God Delusion. She was once a Muslim who became an atheist and wrote an article, also in The Atlantic, entitled, "Why I'm Now a Christian." And he was like, whoa, say what? Richard Dawkins would not believe it. No, you can't be a Christian. And she wrote this article to say, there's something missing in our world, our Western world is tearing itself apart. It's anxious. We should have everything. We've been given everything and we don't know where we're going. There's a change in the air at the cultural elite level. She saw the crisis in the West, but then she saw the crisis in herself. Richard Dawkins, 20 years ago, with Polly Toynbee, another well-known atheist writer in the UK, had launched the slogan on the side of buses in London. There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life. Yet here we are, not enjoying it. A world in the West riven by tribalism, political problems and leadership scandal. So Richard Dawkins decided that he would sit down in a public meeting with Ayaan Hirsi Ali and convince her that she hadn't become a Christian. And by the end of the lecture, he said this, "I came here prepared to persuade you, Ayaan, that you are not a Christian. I think you are a Christian, and I think Christianity is nonsense." But she saw something missing in the framework. And that's at elite level. Here's another thinker for you. Russell Brand, enfant terrible. The man who had everything and everyone, if you believe the papers, who 4 months ago got baptised in the Thames River after doing an Alpha program. If you've seen any of his Netflix comedy series, shame on you. They're all, funny but rude. The man who had everything, including 10 different addictions, as he put it. And he had an interesting journey away from self. And he says this is months before he became a Christian. People are cynical about the increasing interest in Christianity and the return to God, but to me it's obvious. And he literally pretty much said what so many theologians and have been quoted as saying, a comment attributed to another secular writer, David Foster Wallace, at another commencement service, that everyone worships. There's no such thing as an atheist. Everyone worships. And a good enough reason to worship God or some spiritual being, he said, is that anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money, you'll never have enough. If you worship sex and your looks, you'll always feel ugly. And you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you in the ground, he said. Go make a difference, Imagine hearing that at your commencement address. But Russell Brand listed the ways that he had put himself, the autonomous self, on the throne of his life and how it had led to every addiction and every abuse of other people, and it was starting to destroy him. There's an interest in Christianity again. The tide's coming in an anxious age. James Marriott, who looks about 12, but he's, I don't know what his skincare regime is, but look, he's in his 30s and he's very smart and he writes for the Times of London, James Marriott. And he's often written about the secular age we live in and the progress we're making until recently. He said, we may look back on the high point of secularism as a phenomenon peculiar to an age that hubristically believed itself to be at the end of history. We've arrived. The autonomous self is the future of the world. Why can't everyone get on board? an affluent, self-confident and relatively monocultural society that now, he says, belongs to the past. Religion hasn't gone away, he said. He walked past his local Anglican church, a little old building, hundreds of years old, and he opened the door on a Sunday night expecting to see 4 people, and it was full of young people praising God together in community. He expected autonomy, the secular frame of you do you, to liberate us, and it hadn't. He thought that the secular story would slough off all those crazy views about the spirituality and the need for this and the need for that, and it didn't. And he now says that self-confident, affluent, and relatively monocultural society now belongs to the past. You do you isn't working. But let me finish with a personal story of my own church experience, of the church that we go to in Perth. Providence Church in Perth has 3 congregations, or 3 churches. I used to be the pastor of one of them. And every year they have the gathering of all 3 churches where they have the best music team for the, from all the church. And if you're not on the stage, you're not on the best music team, And we have a great preacher. Usually our senior pastor is a great preacher. And my friend, and afterwards there's food on the lawn and stalls and people are selling the things they've been able to make, and it's just fantastic. There's music, like that great music we had tonight. And my friend Ollie came up to me, who I hadn't seen for a while, and he said, I want to introduce you to someone. I said, okay. He said, this is Claire. Claire's just become a Christian. I put on my Terminator 2 glasses to scan her to see, really? Now, Ollie works as the chief designer for all of the Westfield Shopping Centre outfittings in Australia. It's a creative industry. He said, Claire works for me. She's part of my team. So here before me was a 40-year-old creative industry, white, Western, well-educated, wealthy woman. I said, you don't become Christian. People like you don't become Christian. Why? That's kind of convincing she wasn't, I said, how did you become a Christian? And she said, look, I just felt there was something wrong, but I couldn't articulate it. I couldn't figure out this low-grade anxiety I had that was just sitting there. And I was trying all these different things. I should have everything sorted. Look, her husband and her kids were with her, and her husband wasn't a Christian at this stage, and she's happily married. This doesn't make sense. The tide of Christianity is going out. It's you do you society. Why are you becoming a Christian? I said, so how did it happen? She said, well, during COVID, everyone was anxious about losing their job, except Ollie. He wasn't anxious. So I asked him, what's your thing? And he said he was a Christian. And she goes, the Bible? He goes, yeah. He said, maybe I could have a Bible. He goes, yeah, you can have a Bible. And maybe you could read it. I could read it with you at lunchtime if you want. And he said, a few months later, I said, can I go to church? He said, you can come to church with our family. I came to church, and I said, then what happened? Was there a bolt of lightning? I just became a Christian. Made sense. And I went, this is ridiculous, And then I used to be a journalist, a writer. We talked about that. So I asked a good, hard journalistic question. How does it feel? And she said, it feels light. Feels like a burden's rolled off me. I went, wow, that's big. And then because I was a great journalist in the past, I asked another follow-up question, the sucker punch. How else does it feel? I didn't have anything else. That was it. And she said this, it feels like I don't need the approval of other people anymore if Jesus approves of me. It feels like I don't have to go around being and presenting myself to a world that could or could not accept me based on my performance. If Jesus approves of me, that's enough. Liberating. And she doesn't run off and become Amish. She works. She does her job, not to seek the approval of other people, because she's liberated to do it for other people. That's the difference. If it is about you, then everything you do, even the things you present to other people as good, are ultimately about you. The freedom you have to do life for other people only comes when your approval is locked away. That if Jesus approves of me, I can serve you freely in community. And that's why I say to people, why not revisit or visit for the first time the Christian faith? What it does, who it's about, how it liberates, how it frees us from anxiety. Because ultimately, we are not built for self-reliance. We are not our own. There's a restless churn, a burden within us. And I've quoted many modern writers today, but St. Augustine says this to God: you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. We were never intended to be on our own or for our own. And the cool news is we don't have to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.